Hebrews 10 verse 22a to c. Let us draw near, access opened and assurance settled. Let us approach with a true heart and full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience. From explanation to invitation. Hebrews has spent chapter after chapter explaining why the old way could never bring rest. It has walked us through the tabernacle's furniture and rituals, through repeated sacrifices and guarded distances, through priests who stood daily and offerings that never finished their work. Again and again, the letter has insisted that the problem was not devotion but distance, not effort but access. And now, in Hebrews 10 verse 22a to c, something decisive happens. The argument pauses, the explanations recede, and doctrine gives way to summons. Let us draw near. It is a startling shift. The writer does not say, let us admire the sanctuary, or let us study the veil, or let us remember the altar from afar. He does not call the reader to reflection alone, but to movement toward God himself. The door that theology has been describing now swings open, and the invitation is astonishingly direct. This summons marks the transition from religious proxy to personal presence. What once belonged to one man, on one day, under strict conditions, is now addressed to the whole people of God. Ordinary believers, frail, imperfect, often fearful, are summoned into a nearness that was once forbidden. Hebrews 10 verse 22a to c proclaims that because Christ has fully opened priestly access to God, believers are summoned to draw near with sincere hearts and settled assurance, resting not on inward steadiness, but on the once-for-all cleansing of the conscience accomplished by his blood. First, the sacerdotal invitation, let us draw near. The opening command carries unmistakable liturgical weight. The verb, proserkometha, is not casual language. In the Greek scriptures, it is priest language, the technical term for one authorized to approach God in worship. In Leviticus, this approach was hedged about with blood, water, warning, and fear. To draw near was dangerous unless one had been properly prepared. Yet Hebrews places this priestly verb on the lips of the church, not on a single high priest, not on a religious elite, but on the gathered people of God. Let us draw near. The privilege has widened, but not by lowering God's holiness. It has widened because a better priest has come and a better sacrifice has been offered. The access is democratized only because it has first been perfected. As Owen and Hughes both emphasize, the great aim of Hebrews is not merely to show that the way exists, but to press believers to live as those for whom the way has already been opened. This approach is corporate. The letter does not envision isolated mystics drifting into God's presence alone. It envisions a priestly people who together live in the sanctuary air. The Christian life, Hebrews insists, is not meant to be lived in the lobby outside God's presence, peering through theological glass. It is meant to be lived near, consciously, continually, confidently. And yet, this nearness is not reckless. It is not casual familiarity. The writer immediately qualifies how we draw near. Second, a true heart and full assurance, the manner of nearness. The approach is marked by two inseparable qualities, with a true heart and in full assurance of faith. A true heart, 10.22a-c, is not a heart without weakness, but a heart without duplicity. It is the opposite of the divided heart, the performative heart, the heart that manages appearances while withholding itself from God. In Hebrews, the great danger has never been emotional coldness alone, but falsehood, an evil heart of unbelief that slowly drifts while maintaining a religious exterior. A true heart is one brought into alignment. The affections have been schooled by truth. The will has been bent by grace. The person no longer approaches God to impress him, negotiate with him, or keep him at a safe distance. Calvin's instinct here is penetrating. God does not invite us near for display, but for communion. The truest heart is often not the loudest or most confident, but the one that stops pretending. And yet sincerity alone is not enough. The writer adds a phrase that feels almost audacious. In full assurance of faith. Clariforia pistuos does not describe tentative hope or cautious optimism. The term conveys fullness, completeness, a settled conviction. This assurance is not generated by inward steadiness, emotional warmth, or recent obedience. It rests entirely on an objective, historical, heavenly fact. Christ has entered the true sanctuary and has been accepted there. Hebrews has labored to anchor assurance where it cannot fluctuate. Schreiner and Moo are right to insist that this confidence is not psychological bravado, but theological clarity. The believer does not draw near because they feel worthy, but because the priest has been received. Assurance, in Hebrews, flows downward from heaven, not upward from the self. This is why so many Christians live needlessly at a distance. They mistake humility for hesitation. They assume that spiritual seriousness requires standing back. But Hebrews exposes that instinct as a failure to reckon fully with the success of Christ's work. Full assurance is not arrogance. It is faith taking God at His word. Third, hearts sprinkled clean, the conscience settled. The final phrase names the inner barrier that keeps worshipers from drawing near, having our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience. The imagery is unmistakably priestly. In the Old Testament, blood was applied, sprinkled, to consecrate priests and purify sacred space. But Hebrews internalizes the ritual. The sprinkling is no longer external and ceremonial. It is inward and forensic. The conscience here is not merely moral awareness. It is the inner courtroom where accusations echo, where memory rehearses guilt, where fear of divine judgment lingers even after forgiveness has been declared. Under the law, that courtroom was never closed. The sacrifices could remind, restrain, and regulate, but they could not silence the charge. But Christ's blood reaches where ritual never could. The participle used here denotes a completed act with ongoing effect. The conscience has been addressed decisively. The ledger has been settled. Owen and Brown stress that Hebrews is not describing a vague feeling of relief, but a real change of standing. The fear is removed because the charge has been removed. This is the climax of the invitation. The heart is not merely encouraged to feel clean, it has been cleansed. The conscience is no longer a prosecutor demanding payment, but a witness to mercy. Nearness is now possible without pretense, without denial, without fear. The worshiper can remain near because nothing remains unsettled. Reflections for today: nearness without fear. First, this passage exposes how easily prayer can shrink into a cautious visit instead of a homecoming. Many speak to God as though the gate were still guarded, measuring words, editing thoughts, approaching gingerly. Yet Hebrews does not call us to manufacture confidence. It calls us to stand where Christ has already placed us. Nearness is no longer a reward for spiritual strength, but the right of those whose consciences have been cleansed by blood. Second, the sprinkling of the heart speaks directly to the restless modern conscience. Many confuse humility with self-accusation, as though staying low means staying condemned. Hebrews insists otherwise. A conscience cleansed by blood is not a careless conscience, but a quiet one. When past sins resurface, the question is not whether God's welcome has collapsed, but whether faith will rest where God has settled the account. Third, the call to a true heart presses against the varnish of religious appearance. It is possible to maintain Christian habits while remaining guarded, curated, and distant. Hebrews invites something deeper: integrity before God. The sanctuary is not a stage. It is the place where masks finally fall, because nothing remains to be hidden. Finally, this passage speaks gently but firmly to believers who live at a distance out of fear. God does not summon His people near in order to expose them to danger, but because the danger has already been dealt with. Christ did not tear the veil so that His people would hover at the threshold. He opened the way so they might live there. Conclusion: the courage to remain near. Hebrews 10 verse 22a-c is not a poetic flourish. It is a blood-bought summons. The old distance has been abolished. The legal barrier of sin has been removed. The conscience has been cleansed, not managed. And so the great word of Christian worship is no longer stand back, but draw near. not nervously, not conditionally, but with true hearts, full assurance, and consciences settled by a finished sacrifice. Nearness is no longer a fragile moment to be earned, but a permanent position to be inhabited, until the God who welcomed us home brings his people fully into his presence at last. Amen.